Sir, you need to switch cabins with me right now. Don't ask why. Just move. The young flight attendant said it low, almost under her breath, while pretending to check the overhead bin above my seat. I thought I'd misheard her. Then I looked past her, back through business class, and found my daughter watching me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not worry. Calculation. I want to tell you about the week I found out my own daughter was planning to kill me, and how a 26-year-old stranger in an airline uniform saved my life, before I even understood I needed saving. Before I go any further, subscribe if you're the kind of person who believes family should never be a weapon, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 63 years old, a retired structural engineer from Portland, Oregon. For 31 years, I designed bridges, the kind that carry semi-trucks and school buses, and never make the news because they never fail. I built my career on one principle. You don't trust a structure because it looks solid. You trust it because you've tested every load it will ever bear. That principle saved my life on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 41,000 feet above Nebraska. And it's the same principle that's about to save yours, if you're paying attention. Her name was Delaney. The flight attendant, not my daughter. My daughter's name is Renee, and 3 days before that flight, I still believed she was the best thing I'd ever built. Let me back up. Renee is 34. She moved back into my house 11 months ago after her divorce, along with her boyfriend, Curtis, a man who described his job as consulting and who I never once saw consult anything besides my refrigerator. I didn't mind, at first. A father helps his daughter. That's not complicated math. But 11 months of free rent turns a favor into an arrangement, and arrangements have a way of revealing who benefits and who's simply being used. We weren't fighting. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go, and this wasn't a house full of shouting. It was quieter than that. Renee and Curtis had perfected a kind of pleasant distance, polite at dinner, absent the rest of the time, and remarkably interested in subjects that used to bore them completely. My retirement accounts, my health, my will. So when Renee appeared in my workshop on a Sunday afternoon with 2 coffees and a smile I hadn't seen since her wedding day, I noticed things. 31 years of engineering teaches you that anomalies are data, not accidents. Dad, she said, Curtis and I want to take you somewhere. Someplace warm. You've been cooped up in this garage for a year. Where? Scottsdale. A resort. Golf. Spa. The whole thing. Our treat. I set down the wrench I was holding. You two don't have money for a weekend in Scottsdale. We saved? She said too fast. It's already booked. Next Tuesday. Already booked. Not, we're thinking about it. Not, would you be free? Already booked. Before anyone had asked me a single question. The same way you don't ask a bridge if it minds carrying the load, you just build the on-ramp and assume it'll hold. I told her I'd think about it. That night, over dinner, Curtis brought up my retirement account like it was small talk. You've still got that annuity from Bechtel, right? Must have grown a lot over the years. I said I didn't discuss finances at the table. Renee laughed it off, called him nosy, refilled his wine. But I watched the two of them exchange a glance across the table. Quick, practiced. The kind of look that only exists between two people who've rehearsed a conversation and are checking whether it's landing correctly. I taught engineering students for 6 years as an adjunct before I retired fully, and I always told them the same thing. One strange measurement is noise. A pattern of strange measurements is a structural problem. That night, I started logging measurements. The next morning, I found the flight confirmation printed and left on the kitchen counter, like it had been set there for me to see rather than hidden. One-way tickets to Phoenix. Return dates left blank. My seat. 14C. Alone. In economy. Renee and Curtis. 2A and 2B. First class. Side by side. That detail sat wrong in my chest for the rest of the day. If your father is dying of exhaustion and you're flying him to Arizona to relax, you don't put 3 rows of strangers between yourself and him. I said yes anyway. I wanted to see how far the pattern would extend before I called it a conclusion. Packing day, I noticed Curtis helping by going through my bathroom cabinet, holding up bottles, and asking which pills I took and when. I told him I'd handle my own medication, thank you. He backed off too quickly, hands raised, the exact gesture of a man who'd been caught reaching for something he shouldn't. That evening, Renee cooked the first home-cooked meal she'd made in almost a year, and halfway through it, stirring her wine glass like the question had just occurred to her, she asked, "Dad, remind me, is the house still in your name only? Or did you ever add anyone else after Mom passed?" I told her it was still just me. She nodded slowly, like she was filing the answer somewhere specific. I didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, I did something I'd never done before, in my own home. I quietly moved every prescription bottle from the bathroom to my carry-on bag, along with the folder containing my will, my power of attorney documents, and my life insurance policy. I told myself I was being paranoid. I packed them anyway. An engineer overbuilds the foundation even when the ground looks stable, because the ground lies. The drive to the airport was almost silent. Curtis kept checking his phone and turning it face down the second I glanced over. Renee sent 3 text messages and deleted the conversation each time, her thumb moving with a fluency that told me this wasn't the first time she'd done it that week. At security, she insisted on standing directly behind me until my carry-on cleared the scanner, watching it the way you watch something you need to confirm rather than something you're simply waiting for. At the gate, they boarded first without me. First class walking past, coached the way people walk past something they've already decided. Doesn't matter anymore. No wave. No. See you on board. I stood in the boarding line, replaying 11 months of small kindnesses that had started, very recently, to look less like love and more like reconnaissance. I was 3 steps down the aisle, boarding pass in hand, looking for row 14, when a flight attendant fell into step beside me, checked my ticket with theatrical slowness, and said the words that changed everything. "Sir, you need to switch cabins with me right now. Don't ask why. Just move." I froze. "Excuse me? Please." Her voice dropped even lower. "Trade seats with the man in 22F. Do it now, before boarding finishes, and don't look toward first class while you do it." I didn't understand a single part of what she was asking, but 31 years of reading structural failure before it happens had taught me to recognize urgency when it's dressed up as calm. I traded seats. I sat down in 22F, a window seat at the back of the plane, my heart going harder than it had in years, and I watched Delaney walk briskly toward the galley without looking back at me once. We took off. Renee never turned around. Curtis never turned around. For 2 hours I sat in the back of that plane, running the last 3 days through my head like a proof I couldn't quite close, absolutely certain I was overreacting, and equally certain I wasn't. Somewhere over Nebraska, the seatbelt sign switched off, and Delaney appeared at my row, crouching in the aisle, so we were eye level. "Mr. Kessler, I need you to listen to something, and I need you to stay calm, because we still have 2 hours in the air and I can't have you causing a scene." She held up her phone, screen dimmed low, and pressed play. What came through the tiny speaker was a woman's voice, and it took me 1 full second longer than it should have to recognize it as my daughter's. "He already moved his pills into the carry-on, which is fine. That actually helps us, because the ones we need are already crushed into the electrolyte packets Curtis bought. Altitude makes it faster. Cardiac stress at 40,000 feet reads completely different than at sea level. Nobody questions a 63-year-old man having a heart episode on a long flight. That's the whole point of the trip." A man's voice, Curtis responded. Quieter, harder to make out. Something about the policy and clean. "And once we land in Phoenix, it's already too late to test anything useful." Then Renee again, calm as a woman discussing dinner reservations. 810,000. That's what the policy pays out. That covers everything, Curtis. Everything. Stop being nervous about it. The recording ended. I sat in a middle-of-nowhere window seat, 41,000 feet over a state I'd never once needed to think about, and listened to my own pulse instead of the plane. "Where did you get this?" I finally managed. "I was refilling ice near the aft galley before boarding," Delaney said. "Your daughter was on a call in the restroom line, thought no one was listening. I record anything that sounds like it might be a threat to a passenger. I've done it twice before in 4 years. This is the first time it was real." "You believed her." "Immediately." "I believed the math," she said. "Cardiac event, altitude, an insurance number, and a boyfriend who sounded like he needed convincing. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Kessler. That's a plan with a nervous accomplice." I asked her why she hadn't gone to the captain, hadn't grounded the plane, hadn't done something bigger than switching my seat. She told me the truth, which I respected more than reassurance would have. Without more proof, an accusation against two first-class passengers based on an overheard fragment wouldn't hold, and grounding a flight on a hunch could end her career without stopping anything real. What she could do was keep me away from whatever those electrolyte packets contained, keep the recording safe, and get me on the ground in one piece so I could decide what came next with real evidence in hand. You're not the first person in your family to almost lose something to a plan like this, I said. It wasn't a question. Something in the steadiness of her had told me this wasn't professional caution alone. She was quiet for a moment. My uncle. 2 years ago. Nobody caught the pattern until it was too late to prove anything. I told myself, if I ever saw it happening again, I wouldn't stay quiet just because it was inconvenient. I asked for a copy of the recording. She sent it to my email right there in row 22, along with a note of the exact time, gate, and flight number. Unedited, original file. Old instinct, the same one that made me photograph every welded joint on a bridge before signing off on it. Never trust a copy of a copy. Get the source. We landed in Phoenix 2 hours later. I let Renee and Curtis walk off the plane first, watching them from 3 rows back the same way you watch a structure you no longer trust to hold weight. Curtis kept glancing toward the back of the plane, searching for someone who wasn't sitting where they expected. Renee didn't look back once. She'd already stopped thinking about me the moment the seatbelt sign came on. The way you stop thinking about a task you believe is already finished. I didn't confront them at the gate. I've watched enough failed load calculations to know that the worst thing you can do with dangerous information is announce it before you've secured everything it threatens. I told them I was tired, took a separate cab to a hotel instead of the resort, and spent that night doing what I do best, gathering data before drawing conclusions. I called my attorney, Marcus, first thing the next morning, and had him pull my policy. $810,000, exactly the figure from the recording, and buried in the beneficiary history, a change filed 6 weeks earlier. My niece Cassie, who I'd named as secondary beneficiary after my wife passed, had been quietly removed. In her place, Renee, sole beneficiary, 100%. The signature authorizing the change was mine. Except it wasn't the loop on my capital W ran the wrong direction. A detail no one who hadn't watched me sign 4 decades of engineering permits would ever have noticed. But I'd been signing my name the same exact way since 1987, and this wasn't it. I had Marcus pull banking records next. Over the previous 5 months, $11,000 had moved out of an account Renee shouldn't have had access to at all, in increments small enough that I'd never once flagged them on a statement. I barely read closely anymore. And buried in an email thread, Marcus's investigator later recovered from a shared cloud drive Curtis had forgotten to log out of. On my home computer, a message from a man calling himself a wellness consultant, quoting a price of $9,000 for something described only as a compound, tasteless, metabolizes fast, undetectable in standard tox panels within 6 hours. I sat with all of it laid out on a hotel desk in Scottsdale. The recording, the forged signature, the bank transfers, the email, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, grief. The particular grief of realizing the daughter you raised had, at some point I couldn't pinpoint, started treating you as a structural problem, to be solved, rather than a person to protect. I flew home 2 days later, alone, on a different flight, and I didn't say a word to either of them about what I knew. I let them return from a trip they thought had failed only because I'd mysteriously avoided a heart episode, and I watched them try to figure out what had gone wrong, without ever suspecting I'd heard the plan itself. For 6 weeks I lived in that house, gathering everything Marcus's investigator needed: copies, dates, verified originals. While Renee grew steadily more anxious and Curtis started disappearing for longer stretches, the way people do when a plan starts falling apart, and no one wants to be the one holding it when it does. The morning I finally laid it all on the kitchen table, the forged form, the bank statements, a printed transcript of Delaney's recording, Curtis went white and said almost nothing. Renee tried 3 different versions of an explanation before landing on silence. I told her the same thing I used to tell junior engineers who tried to talk their way around a failed stress test. The data doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about what actually happened. I called the police that afternoon. 11 months after Flight 247 left Portland, without any incident anyone besides 3 people ever knew about, I sat in the third row of a Multnomah County courtroom and watched my daughter learn what I'd spent 31 years teaching engineering students. A structure built on a lie eventually meets a load it can't survive. Delaney testified first. She described the overheard call in careful, unembellished detail, no exaggeration, no drama, just what she'd heard and why she'd acted. The prosecutor played her recording for the jury, and I watched 12 strangers hear my daughter's voice discuss my heart the way you'd discuss a home renovation budget. Nobody in that room moved. The defense tried to argue the recording had been taken out of context, that electrolyte packets and cardiac event could mean almost anything. That argument survived exactly as long as it took the prosecution's next witness, a document examiner, to walk the jury through the forged beneficiary signature stroke by stroke, comparing it against 40 years of my authentic signature on permits, contracts, and tax filings. Then came the bank investigator, laying out $11,000 in transfers, no legitimate explanation ever accounted for. Then the recovered email thread with the so-called wellness consultant, who it turned out had already been convicted once before, in a different state, for something disturbingly similar. When I testified, the prosecutor asked why I hadn't confronted Renee the moment I heard the recording on the plane. Because a recording isn't proof by itself, I said. It's a hypothesis. You don't sign off on a bridge because one measurement looks bad. You verify every load path before you draw a conclusion that changes someone's life. I spent 6 weeks verifying. Then I drew the conclusion. And what was that conclusion? That my daughter had priced my death at $810,000 and was 3 days away from collecting. I didn't look at Renee when I said it. I looked at the jury instead, the way you look at the people whose job it is to decide whether a structure holds or fails. The jury took most of a day. When they came back, Renee was found guilty on the major counts: conspiracy, forgery, financial fraud. Curtis, who'd cooperated once the case against him became undeniable, received a lighter sentence in exchange for testimony that closed the last gaps in the evidence, including the identity of the man who'd supplied what the lab eventually confirmed was a lethal compound designed specifically to mimic a spontaneous cardiac event in an older adult. I felt no satisfaction watching the verdict read. I felt what I imagine every engineer feels standing in the wreckage of something they built with their own hands and believed in completely, right up until the moment it collapsed under a weight they never saw coming. In the months afterward, restitution orders addressed what could be recovered of the stolen money. I changed the locks on my house, though there was no one left who had a key I hadn't already taken back. I rewrote my will with Marcus's help, one clean document with no ambiguity in it anywhere. And this time, I had it independently witnessed and notarized by someone with no relationship to my family at all. The bulk of what I've spent a lifetime building will now fund an engineering scholarship for first-generation students at Oregon State, the same program that gave a kid from a logging town in the Willamette Valley a chance he never should have had access to on paper alone. Delaney and I still talk, every few months. She left that airline 8 months after the trial and started training as a paralegal. She told me once that watching a recording actually matter, actually hold up, actually put someone away, was the first time in years she'd felt like paying attention could change an outcome, instead of just documenting one that was already decided. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand where I failed Renee, or if failure is even the right word for what happened. Some structures don't fail because the engineer made a mistake. Sometimes the material itself was never what you thought it was, and you don't find out until the load comes. A year after the trial, I stood in front of a room of engineering freshmen at Oregon State, the first class the scholarship fund had ever admitted, and I wrote 3 lines on the whiteboard behind me. One measurement is noise. A pattern is data. Verify before you build on it. Then I added a 4th line, one I'd never taught a classroom before that day, one I'd only ever learned at 41,000 feet over Nebraska, listening to my own daughter's voice through a stranger's phone. When the load doesn't match what you were promised, trust the load, not the promise. I survived Flight 247 because a 26-year-old I'd never met chose not to stay quiet. But I survived everything that came after because I finally stopped trusting the story I wanted to believe about my own daughter and started trusting the evidence sitting right in front of me. That's the last thing I ever taught in a classroom about family. It's the most important thing I ever learned about it.